and welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. It is the 15th of May 2019 and it is a Wednesday. Welcome Smaulgld mug stackers and game changers. Tonight's topic: are Trump's tariffs working? We see New York Times columnist and Chuck Schumer lending support to Trump's strategy. And we're going to discuss whether just lending support because they believe it or because they believe that Trump's tariff strategy will lead to economic disaster and the end of his presidency. Just a little speculation there. But we're going to go through some concepts of tariffs, because a lot of people are looking at this. They have their views on tariffs. I believe in free trade and tariffs are bad, so this is a bad idea. And we're going to show who believes that. And then we're going to take a look at some of the other points of view that aren't purely economic. But first, let's take a look at the economics of tariffs. And we go all the way back to Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, or the Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations. And he makes a very good point. The book is all about international relations and trade, inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And he makes a very good point about, he takes it on a macro level, the division of labor. If someone can do something better than you and you can do something better than someone else, well, that will lead to a barter situation where if you can make eggs or grow eggs and someone else can grow wheat and you have the chickens and they have the farmland, well, it makes sense that let him farm the wheat and let you tend to the hens and bring the eggs. Makes total sense. Economically, people do what they can do most efficiently and let others do what they can do most efficiently, and that's how you get overall wealth growth, because people are producing what they can produce in the most effective manner. It wouldn't make sense if I only had an acre of land on which the chickens are running to decide I'm going to grow the wheat, and the guy who has 500 acres of land decides he's only going to tend chickens. So you can see how it's a pretty obvious way that people organize themselves, economies organize themselves in accordance with who does things the best. Now take it to a larger scale. It makes sense that Florida produces citrus oranges and can ship them to Oklahoma. Now, you could grow oranges in Oklahoma probably with a lot of effort and a lot of greenhouses and a lot of investment. But why would you bother when in Oklahoma you can raise steer, you can raise cattle, you can drill for oil? It doesn't make any sense for you to bother with the citrus. So Florida as a state can produce the citrus, and in fact it can produce oranges for the whole country, or maybe even parts of the world. And it makes sense to let Florida make oranges or grow oranges. It doesn't make sense to say, well, we want to be self-sufficient, we're just going to grow our own oranges here in Oklahoma. No, you trade with Florida, Florida trades with you. You can see you can expand this globally. It's the same thing. So Adam Smith makes the point that division of labor also applies on the national and international scale or stage, because if people or countries are specialized in one type of production of goods or services and another isn't, well, now you have a market, because the country that can produce the good or service the best, the cheapest, can sell it to the country who either can produce it or won't produce it, or just doesn't have the resources to produce it, can't produce it as cheaply. And so you conduct trade. And the country that produces the goods can sell them to the country that doesn't produce them. And then there generally is a balance of trade, because the country that doesn't produce the good from one country produces another good, and maybe it doesn't sell it directly to the country it's getting those goods from, but it sells it somewhere else. And they pay for the goods from the monies they make from selling their own goods. Now, To complicate it, though, when you move on to the United States, a lot of what the trade in the United States is, the United States has taken a view, for better or for worse, well, we'll just issue dollars instead of trade for the goods. So if a country like China wants to send the United States a lot of goods, the United States will just buy them and we'll issue dollars for them. So in a sense, the dollar becomes a good. That's not the same thing as producing an item or a good. It's basically having the reserve currency so that it has some value and you can trade it for goods. But Smith goes on and he says, if a foreign country can supply us, and I guess he's talking about England at the time, late 18th century, if a foreign country can supply us with a commodity cheaper than we ourselves can make it, better buy it of them with some part of the produce of our own industry employed in a way which we have some advantage. So he's saying what I was talking about is we could buy the goods from another country who can make a commodity cheaper from the profits that we make on something else that we have some advantage, that we actually sell. So in the example of Oklahoma versus Florida, you will say, look, Florida can supply us with a commodity cheaper than we can make it ourselves. And so we're going to buy oranges from Florida from the profits that we make from growing grain or raising cattle or oil. And he says, the value of a country's annual produce is certainly more or less diminished when it is thus turned away from producing commodities evidently of more value than the commodity which it is directed to produce by trade policies. So he's basically says this is not a free market. If you start having trade policies, then you don't get where the natural flow of goods might go. Naturally, without any market intervention, people will automatically arrange their affairs to producing what they're best at producing and then taking the profits from what they make and what they're best at producing and buying goods and services from others who make those goods and services because they're the best or the cheapest provider of those goods and services. Now, that's an ideal world. That may work in individuals, but once you get to the macro scale where you have countries with trade policies, it all falls apart. We're going to get to it in a minute. And Smith All right, we got cut off. I don't know where we were when we got cut off. I just noticed that we got cut off. All right, let me try to just recap what I was talking about. If I repeat myself, so be it. I was saying in a normal free market with no trade policies where countries are trading along the lines of the way individuals would, where everyone is acting in their own self-interest. They are trading with and amongst themselves based on what they can produce best, and then with the profits they make from making their own goods or services, they then buy goods and services from others who are making or producing or providing services of what they produce best. And that is the best way for an economy to grow because it's a division of labor. And you can see how if it works in small groups of individuals dividing labor up, it can work amongst small states. It should be able to work. It should be able to work on an international level. But of course, on an international level, it doesn't always work out that way. And that's what we're seeing with China. But for example, with China, if they're just making cheap goods, the rationale there would be, then let them make them. If you go back to the original statement and let us buy them for cheaper, who's harmed? Let's go back to the original statement in Book 1 of The Wealth of Nations, basically saying that the power of exchanging that gives occasion to the division of labor, so the extent of this division must always be limited by the extent of that power, in other words, by the extent of the market. When the market is very small, no person can have encouragement to dedicate himself entirely to one employment, for want of the power to exchange all that surplus part of the produce of his own labor, which is over and above his consumption, for such parts of produce of other men's labor as he has occasion. Goes on further to say, if a foreign country can supply us with a commodity cheaper than we can ourselves make it, better buy it of them with some part of the produce of our own industry employed in a way in which we have some advantage. So, better for us to trade with China and take their cheap goods and pay for them with whatever we do best. And some people say what we do best is because our economy is strong, not necessarily because we produce a lot, but we do. And the United States does produce a lot. It produces airplanes, microchips, a lot of things for export. Now, oil, we're going to get into that in a minute, energy. But to use your own advantage is to buy the cheap goods. And you would think that that's how it all works out. That China produces cheap goods, the United States produces other goods, and the United States buys the other goods with the profits that it makes from the sale of its own goods. However, it doesn't all work out that easily when you're talking about nations, because nations have interests other than economics. And I think that is there's two issues here. The economics aren't clean. We're going to go through that. And the trade war with China is about more than simply economics. So when I say it's not clean, let's talk about the lay of the land before the tariffs started. Remember, in Adam Smith's world, it doesn't make any sense for anyone to have tariffs because tariffs are bad across the board. The way Adam Smith looks at it is, if a country has tariffs placed on its goods, yes, that's a disadvantage. But if it then turns around and places tariffs on the other country's goods, well, that's shooting itself in the foot, is what Adam Smith would say, is tariffs are bad no matter how you look at it. They're bad if they're in place, but they're also bad if they're retaliatory because, in Adam Smith's view is, for example, in the case of China, well, now China's going to send products to the United States, and if the United States has tariffs on them, that's just simply going to remove the advantage that the United States has of being able to take advantage of the lower priced labor and products that come from China. And you would think, well, there you go. That's it. Stupid. And our people are taking this point of view. It's dumb to even put tariffs in place, and then you get the whole people don't understand economics. Well, it's not just about economics, but it's also not as simple as just saying you don't understand economics. Because, first of all, and I'll give you an example before we get into Trump's point of view. Peter Schiff is of this pro-market point of view. And here's how he looks at it. And when I read you the comment, you'll realize that he's missing a big point. Let me pull it up right here. He's under anti-Trump. Okay. Peter Schiff says, the idea that we have more weapons in the trade war because we can tariff more on products is wrong-headed. He's taking the classical Adam Smith point of view. Tariffs hurt the country that imposes them the most. Okay, so if the United States now puts tariffs on China, that's going to hurt the United States under the theory that now the United States can't pick up the cheap goods from China. So why would you do that? You're just hurting the consumers in America. He says, so tariffs hurt the country that imposes them the most, not the other way around. And then he says, you don't win a war by shooting your own troops. That's the classic Adam Smith point of view. However, take his logic to the extreme, that if the country that's putting the tariffs on the most is going to hurt the country the most, then how has China done so well the last 10 years and been growing at a rapid rate when it is the country that had the tariffs on foreign goods? Well, you can't answer that question using Adam Smith because China runs a centrally planned top-down economy, and they had tariffs on the goods coming in. And according to the Adam Smith, Peter Schiff logic, that the country that puts the tariffs on is the one that's going to be hurt the most. Well, I would say in the last 10 years, China, now putting aside also, see, because it's not just as simple as trade, putting aside the fact that China has printed massive amounts of currency, gone into tremendous amounts of debt in order to meet non-economic policies, which are full employment based on however you can do it, and building things that no one needs. These don't fit into the Adam Smith economy because Adam Smith is somewhat pre-Chicago school, that no one would do something like that because it's against their economic self-interest. Generally, in the Adam Smith world, the Chicago School of Economics world, there's an allocation of resources that makes sense based on economic demand. Now, they're not saying that anytime economic resources are expended, they will meet perfectly demand, but they never envisioned countries like China or the United States doing QE and printing money and building bridges to nowhere simply to create economic activity so they can move hundreds of millions of people into cities and then build 3 cities that they're never going to use. That doesn't make any sense, and it's illogical to even put that into an economic free market analysis. But be it as it may, that is what is happening in the world. We don't have free trade. We've had tariffs, not just in the United States, all over the world. So the whole tariff situation is way out of whack, and it is possible to use tariffs to your advantage, as China has, and gain an economic advantage. So what the United States is doing, under the Adam Smith, Peter Schiff point of view, would never work, because all you're doing is shooting yourself in the foot. And Schiff says you're shooting your own troops. But it's a lot more than that, because if a country gains economic advantage through tariffs and other economic policies, including their own domestic policies, then if they are a political adversary or a geopolitical foe, they gain geopolitical advantage by being able to fund military, spying operations, and so on. So it goes beyond simple economics. And just before we got on tonight, Trump declared a national emergency about IT in the country, and this is really aimed at Chinese UI, as they put spyware into the phones, and so we're not allowed to have those phones in the United States. And again, that is a non-economic argument, because in a truly economic sense, China would never put spyware in its phones. If you are a manufacturer and what you're trying to do is the Chicago School of Economics theory of you maximizing your value, you're looking for economic efficiencies, you don't sell something to a customer with spyware in it unless you have objectives that go beyond economics. Now, China probably figures they can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. They can sell a lot of phones and they can spy. But primarily, I think they'd rather spy than, because they're making money on other objects that they sell and items that they sell that don't have spyware in them. So that's why you can't look at this as neatly as, well, tariffs are bad, and anyone who understands economics knows tariffs are bad, and anyone who wants tariffs is an ignoramus. No, that's like saying gold is money, period. There are no absolutes, even though, and what people do is they rely on the fact that they've read something on it, or that some expert says that tariffs are bad. Adam Smith, Peter Schiff. Doesn't mean that they're right, because this is a classic case of academia almost, where you believe in dogma that generally is correct. It's not, the concept behind tariffs are bad is correct, that it's not good. However, in the United States case with China, China's had 10, 15 years to gain economic advantage. And then there's social issues in the United States, which is, well, what does the United States do if it can't manufacture things? Well, then it has to shift to learn to code. If you remember that one, that's what they told all of the miners and the steel workers that, well, you can't do that anymore. And what's it going to do? Wave a magic wand? Those jobs aren't coming back. There was that whole concept. So it's not as simple as just economics. There's politics involved. There's human suffering involved. There's a dislocation of people, families. It gets into alcoholism. It's loss of dignity, loss of work. And then the government changes everything around and says, okay, we're going to give you welfare, we're going to give you subsidies. And China's doing the same thing. They're not acting necessarily just as two entities that have set themselves as economic entities that all they do is buy and sell goods, produce goods, sell goods, and trade goods. There's a lot more involved in it. It's a very mindless way to look at it. Just say, China produces goods for cheap and we buy them for cheap. Why wouldn't we want to do that? Well, you can think it through. There's a lot more to it than just that. But let's look now, though, at where, and that's a good thing. Let's look at where China and the United States and where Trump is with all this. Well, here's another point. Not all goods, as we mentioned, are created equal. So what the imports that China gets from the United States arguably are more important to China, even though the dollar amount is far less. So, for example, China exports $500 billion to the U.S., the United States exports $150 billion, rough numbers. But a lot of what the United States gets are maybe less essential items. Why? Because what China gets from the United States are food and energy. And that's the one thing I think that China said not to put the tariffs on. Now, without the food and the energy, China can't produce the goods to send to us. So it is asymmetrical. It's not just what items and goods and services are being sold or exchanged for. It's what importance are those goods and services that are being exchanged. China has 1.3 billion people. They've got to be fed. They've moved a lot of farmers out of the country to move them into the cities to make the goods to ship to the United States and Europe. Well, that means they don't have the same farming capacity. So they've got to import food. Not a problem. Well, now there is a problem because now they have to play save face with the United States, so they got to start slapping their own tariffs on things. So yes, it's not good in the aggregate. You could say no one wins a trade war. That's not true. During the trade war, probably no one wins. There's definitely a slowing of economic activity, a slowing of trade, which can lead to a slowing down of the standard of living because the goods come in at a higher price and people pay a higher price for them, so they consume less. And you can see how that degenerates or deteriorates. However, no one fights a war to be in a permanent state of war. I think the point that Adam Smith and everyone else misses who believes this stuff is that somehow tariffs should be a permanent fixture and they should be symmetrical. Actually, tariffs are fine if they are asymmetrical and they lead towards a reduction in the overall amount of tariffs. And they tie in with a country's geopolitical objective. So oil is it's not Iran, Russia, they have oil. They can use that as a weapon because people need oil. China, it's harder for China to use refrigerators as a weapon when in today's world, anyone can make a refrigerator. And there are a lot of places where you can make cheap refrigerators. But not every country has the ability to produce food or to produce oil. And so it becomes an issue. So let's see what... so I actually believe the United States is in a far better position here to reduce the tariffs on the goods that China has on the U.S. stuff coming in. And the only way they're going to get them to do that is by putting the tariffs on the goods coming in from China into the United States. All right, what else do we have? And by the way, this is going to impact the Smaulgld mugs, so order your Smaulgld mugs. I have existing supplies. I don't know how the manufacturer is going to deal with them, but I did see this coming, and I do have a few crates that I can ship at the same price and not have to lower prices. So that's an example. You go to smaulgld.com and you can purchase them there. But that's an example also what manufacturers, entrepreneurs do is they anticipate tariffs, they stockpile goods. Certain goods you can't stockpile. Mugs, fortunately, you can stockpile. Now, eventually, if the tariffs go on long enough, what will happen with the Smaulgld mugs is if they become too expensive because of tariffs, and this is what Trump wants, that they will make the mugs here in the United States and employ people here in the United States. So there is a goal other than just getting people the cheapest goods. Because China's goal was to get people employed. But here's an interesting point. Many gold bugs like Peter Schiff, Austrian economist, free market economist, Chicago School, whatever it is, they have been bemoaning that the U.S. is dependent on China sending the U.S. cheap goods and the U.S. going into this unsustainable debt and sending China pieces of paper. So when you put these tariffs on to reverse this, they start screaming free markets and tariffs are bad. It's because dogma doesn't work across the board. If you want to stay dogmatic, well then you can't be complaining about China sending us stuff and us printing up dollars in the Federal Reserve printing money to pay for it. If you want to get out of that, the United States has to start producing again. How are they going to produce if all the stuff they're going to produce can economically be produced cheaper somewhere else? Because China is willing to subsidize and pay its workers a lot less and then subsidize them to ship the goods here for free. So what is the United States supposed to do? It's not a free market, and I think that's what a lot of people miss. They just insist on free markets and tariffs are bad, and I actually think the United States is in the driver's seat in this because China needs food and oil and dollars because their economy runs on dollars more than the United States needs refrigerators and other cheap items that can be bought elsewhere. They can be made elsewhere or they can be made in the United States. What was interesting today was we had Bannon, who is a... You got to remember, a lot of this is nationalism as opposed to conservatism or liberalism or free markets. It's more about leaders of countries believing they're doing what's right for their country, and that's where tariffs come in. But what's interesting today was Bannon was going off about how he loves the tariffs and we have to stand up to China. But we had Chuck Schumer and Friedman from the New York Times saying that Trump should stand tall, stay strong in his battle with China. Now, Friedman's from the New York Times, the failing New York Times, right, as Trump calls them. And he's been saying that this is something that's going to impact the United States, and it's time to act now, nip it in the bud, so to speak, because China's been using its dominance and its government to push an agenda where they have a certain hegemony in production. And then they use that to gain geopolitical influence. They use that to buy, they got the Belt and Road. They can expand their military as a result of the monies that they get by subsidizing goods that are purchased for, quote, real money by the rest of the world. It's very interesting to see Bannon and Friedman, New York Times guy, and even Chuck Schumer doing the same thing. Now, Biden is, and this is where it gets interesting here too, Biden's a big fan of China. Seems he's made a lot of money in China, and he's mad now with Schumer for saying that he should stand tall, strong against China. And Biden had said the other day, China's not a a threat to us at all. No, he's lining your pockets, probably. And so Biden slams Trump over escalating trade war with China. Now you got your pro-Trump people on his side, but then you also have a very unlikely group of Friedman and Schumer being in favor of this. But here's what Bernie has to say. I don't think Bernie understands any of this. He thinks everything should be free, but he says, the economy is doing well, and I'm sure I don't have to give Trump any credit. I'm sure he'll take all the credit he wants. Okay, so Donald Trump says, wrong, go star, Bernie. The economy's doing great. It would have crashed if my opponent and yours, crooked Hillary, had ever won. And that's a good thing. All right, let's see what Trump has been. Now we're going to get an insight into how Trump is viewing this. He's not looking at this as if he's a free market economist. He's not looking at this from an ideological point of view. He's not looking at it from a dogmatic point of view. He's looking at it as a game to win. He's looking at it from the point of view of a nationalist and what's best for the United States. And here's Peter Schiff saying, we're going to lose this war. We're going to lose it badly. The winner's going to be China. Now, when Peter says that, it's because he's been saying China to crush the dollar. He's always focused on the U.S. debt. He's never focused on the Chinese debt. And he's been saying that China is the best. It's got it going on. It produces, and we just send them paper. He's missing the point that China produces a lot of paper, too. Probably 3 times the amount of debt that the United States does. But let's skip Peter's Schiff now and move on to what Trump has been saying about all these tariffs. All right, I go through them in no particular order. He says, I say openly to President Xi and all my friends in China that China will be hurt very badly if you don't make a deal because companies will be forced to leave China for other countries. Too expensive to buy in China. You had a great deal, almost completed, and you backed out. Now, apparently there was a deal, and this is not atypical of, and it's just a cultural thing, and I've dealt with it in business. When Chinese do a deal with you, or they come up with an agreement, they don't have the same Anglo-Saxon point of view that you have a contract and therefore what's in the contract is how your relations are governed. That's the purpose of a Western contract, that you each restrict your behaviors with respect to each other. You agree to pay each other certain amounts. You agree to do things for each other, and they're all spelled out in the confines of the contract. When you negotiate oftentimes with a Chinese counterpart, they'll do the same negotiation. They'll agree to the contract. And then you'll get a call a week later and they'll say, how about we, instead of 27 mugs, we do 45 mugs next week. And you say, no, we can only do 27. It's in the contract. They say, yeah, but we're friends. And they view the contract as the beginning of a relationship rather than the final memorialization of the agreement that you have. So, I don't know if Trump knows this, but the fact that he thinks they reneged on their deal, that they decided, no, we're not, they backed down is what he's saying. It's probably they didn't back down. They thought they had an agreement, and they thought, okay, so now it's more of a fluid type of agreement, and so they decided that, okay, now that we've gotten that far, it's almost like now that we've agreed to something, now we don't have to agree to it anymore because we've agreed to that. Let's move on to something else. So Trump is doing his whole threatening. There'll be nobody left in China to do business with. Very bad for China. Good for the USA. China, then he starts berating them. China's taken advantage of the U.S. for so many years that they're way ahead. Our presidents do the job. Therefore, China should not retaliate. It will only get worse. And what does he expect them to do? And now he's threatening that many tariff companies will be leaving China for Vietnam. This is my point, that other countries can make some of the cheap stuff that China makes. Remember, natural resources, now they do have rare earth metals. That's an important thing that China has. But certain things like oil that people need, people don't need gold. Silver they might need. Certain commodities that are required in industry, it's hard for a country if they don't have those commodities to produce them. So if it's just a matter of labor, every country has a certain labor pool. So he's saying that basically we can get our stuff somewhere else, or we can make it ourselves. What else has he been saying? And he's making all these arguments, and they go counter to somebody who is who's believing in their economic dogma and not tying in either the fact that the economics aren't as neat as they wish them to be, but also there's geopolitical and domestic issues. Then he says, we are right where we want to be with China. Remember, they broke the deal. Now he's harping on this. They reneged on the deal with us, and they tried to renegotiate. That's just the way they negotiate. We will be taking in tens of billions of dollars in tariffs from China. Buyers of products can make it themselves in the United States, ideal, or buy it from non-tariff countries. So again, he's saying in the marketplace, we don't have to deal with you. We can deal with somebody else. We'll just make the stuff ourselves. That's what he wants. Now that's not an economic goal. That's more of a national goal. Well, we'll just make it here ourselves. Even if it's more expensive, at least the Americans will have the jobs. That's somewhat how China runs. They figure we want full employment for Chinese. We want to feed all the people that 30, 40 years ago were living on a subsistence diet. And look what they've done. They've achieved a national goal of a wealthier China by far today than it was 30, 40 years ago. All through a national policy that did not neatly fit into an Adam Smith free market trading. They had tariffs. They did subsidies. They did all types of non-free market stuff, and yet they became rich. That goes against the idea that free markets are what produce the riches. No, it looks like when you have these rigged governments and markets, as we're seeing, for example, you can make a lot of money now in the market with companies that don't make any money. That doesn't make any economic sense. How is Tesla worth billions and billions of dollars? It doesn't make any money. We've talked about the other day, Snapchat, Uber, Lyft. Even though those stocks have gone down, they still came out with multi-billion-dollar market caps, and they still have multi-billion-dollar market caps. And people have been making money on these types of stocks for decades now. Really, for decades, they've been pumping out companies that make no money. This doesn't fit into and that's why people that believe in free markets, they scoff at this stuff, not realize. Look, you know what happened today? Warren Buffett, they're saying now, has $900 million worth of Amazon. Well, he was scoffing at internet companies for 20 years. Now he realizes that, well, there's money in that kind of stuff. That's what happens. But then Trump goes almost full on comrade. He says, we will then spend match or better the money that China, where's he going to get this money? That China may no longer be spending with our great patriot farmers, agricultures, which is a small percentage of total tariffs received, and distribute the food to starving people in nations around the world. Now, this is not an economic plan to subsidize farmers for what they lose from trade with China, and then to give them more money so they can produce more, so they can give away food to starving people in nations around the world. And that's a good thing, because the poor are starving to death because of Trump. Well, he's going to fix that, he says. All right, so you can see where Trump is coming from. It's a mishmash of economics and geopolitical and domestic policy goals that are going on here. And today Trump said, game over. He said China will be pumping money into their system, which is what they do, and will probably be reducing interest rates as always in order to make up for the business they are and will be losing. He's got it right. That's exactly what they do. But then he says, hey, we could do that if the Federal Reserve ever did match. I don't know, it means another big QE. It would be game over. We win. In any event, China wants a deal. Now you're beyond economics. This is lunacy, well, economic lunacy. But there's a concept, I think it's a lot of economic thought, is that people act in their own self-interest and they act in accordance with sound economics. No, they don't. They act in accordance with emotions oftentimes. People do stupid things with money. Yeah, they think, sometimes you make a mistake. They may think they're acting in their own economic self-interest, but sometimes people do things totally against their self-interest. There's an old Chicago School of Economics joke where the two Chicago School of Economics professors are walking down the street with, I guess, a layperson, and there's a few $20, $100 bills on the sidewalk, and they all walk right by them, and the guy who's the young guy, and he's kind of in awe that he's with these two big professors. And he says, well, wasn't that a few $100s on the street back there? And he says, nah, it couldn't have been. If there was, someone would have picked them up already. So they believe that markets are so efficient that something like that wouldn't happen. There wouldn't be money on the ground because someone would have picked it up already. But again, people that believe this economic dogma are not taking into account there's more to life than economics. There's more considerations than just economics. So Trump further says, I think China felt they were beaten so badly in the recent negotiations, they may want to wait for the next election in 2020 to see if they can get lucky and have a Democrat win, in which case they would continue to rip off the United States for $500 billion a year. Then he says, he's making a shot at China Biden collusion there. Such an easy way to avoid tariffs? Make or produce your own goods and products in the good old USA. It's very simple. That's what Trump says. Just simple. Just start making refrigerators. And actually, it isn't that hard. And you know what makes it easier? The free market moves slower than if the government just said, I'm not advocating this, but this is what China does. We're now going to subsidize the refrigerator market and line up and make your bids and start making refrigerators. And then say the price of the refrigerator has to be X price, and here's your government contract, and make 3 million refrigerators. Problem solved. You still get cheap refrigerators. Now, who pays for it? It's a separate issue. But you can see how this has nothing to do with free market economics when you have people who are willing to do things that are non-free market. All right, I can go on here with Trump, but I think you get the idea that anybody who's thinking that, this is an outrage, they're not following free markets. Well, no one's following free markets. China's not following free markets. United States isn't following free markets. It's almost you're denying reality to stick with your dogma and insist that everything's going to be fine if we just don't put tariffs on it. Hey, he says it again here. China buys much less from us than we buy from them by almost $500 billion. He says this almost every day now. We're in a fantastic position. What does that mean, fantastic position? To get cheap goods from China? No. That's the economic goal. Why would we want to give up cheap economic goods from China? Because it's not just about cheap goods from China. Make your product at home in the USA and there is no tariff. See? Problem solved. The problem is tariffs. But who invented the tariffs? Well, Trump did. Well, no, he didn't because China had them first. It's a lot more complicated than just tariffs are bad, okay? You can also buy from a non-tariff country. He's harping again. Get stuff from Vietnam. Now, who is he telling this to? He's not telling this to you. He's telling this to companies that import Chinese goods. They're the ones who pay the tariff, not China. China pays in the sense that they just don't get as much revenue because people stop buying the stuff if there's a 25% tariff. He's saying, look, if you're importing Chinese stuff, start importing it from Vietnam. Go to South Korea. Get it over there. Get it from Africa. Get it wherever you can. Just don't get it from China. And he says many companies are leaving China. All right. I think we've talked enough about this. Let's see what you guys are saying in the comments about all this tariff stuff. If you want your comment called out, put Smaulgld, Smaulgld, and I will comment on your comment, or if you have a question, try to answer the question, or if you've just got some good things to say, then let's have at it. I'm going to start taking a look now. I'm putting up the fundraising page there. There we go. Oh, by the way, so before I get to your comments, you know we have Saturday Night Silver with Smaulgld, popular demand. We then added gold, solid gold, Sunday with Smaulgld. Then we had a request for a crypto night, so we're going to do that on Friday nights. So those of you who like cryptos, you're going to get all crypto on Friday night. If you don't like cryptos, don't tune in. For those of you who love silver, we're just going to talk about silver Saturday night. If you don't like silver, don't tune in. Same with gold on Sunday night. And then the rest of the week, we'll do what we've been doing, is giving a broad overview of different topics and covering gold, silver, crypto economics, and whatever else comes up in the news. All right, let's see what we have over here. Philip is here. We've got two Phils. We got Phil McCain and Phil Quinn. And Jack is also here. And yes, Jack, I did answer your question, even though to the group, that the mugs, the Smaulgld mugs, are made in China. Pablo, good to see you. And Gypsy Tree, Gold back yuan, game over. Yes. Federal rate cut, game over. Trump's words. Yes, that's what he said. Oh, you said that probably before I read that comment. Yeah. Rate cut for gold. Trump said at the Federal Reserve, yes, cut rates, says Pablo. We win the trade war. Game over. Actually, he was saying if they did like QE or something like that. All right, Gypsy Tree. He didn't call me out on this, but he's asking a question. Is it a myth that gold is inversely correlated to interest rates? What are they called? Real interest rates, yes. iGold showed a chart of the biggest gold runs are in times of rising rates. Would a near-term cut be bearish? It's the rate over the inflation rate. So if you have rising interest rates, it's generally because you have a rising inflation rate. But if the rates are lower than the rate of inflation, which happens when the Fed is behind the curve and is trying to squash inflation by raising rates, then gold will be rising because, let's say that's 8% inflation and interest rates are 6%. You're losing 2%. So you go to gold. So that's what they're talking about there, Gypsy Tree. The leash is off. We didn't even talk about Iran or any. I mean, there's a lot going on, but I just wanted to focus on the tariffs because this is something that's going on at the moment. Pablo Pena Lewis said something smart. Never. Don't expect gold to do what it should do. Gold does what it does. Well, that's the same with everything. People have their dogmatic views, and they just insist, and they stare on with incredulous looks on their faces. How does a company with this EBITDA or this have such a low valuation or such a high valuation? It's like, because it does. The world doesn't, the markets don't follow neatly either what you think, maybe you're even wrong in what you think should happen, or there's other elements at play, intervention, whatever it is. But people find it very hard that the world is not the way they think it should be. Look, if you could figure out how every asset should be valued, you'd be really rich. But what happens instead is you learn something incorrect, like the gold-silver ratio should be 16-1. And then you convince yourself there's something wrong why it isn't. And you never think, why isn't it 16-1? Why isn't it 15-1? Why isn't it 1-1? And it keeps going higher, and you just tell yourself and you listen to more nonsense, and you convince yourself of something that doesn't make any sense other than you want to believe it. That's just a fact. That's what happens when people look at things. Oh, you hear Peter say, well, the world figures out I'm right. The world's not going to figure out you're right. That's not how it works. But anyway, yes, you're right, Pablo. Gold doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It does what it does. Yes, tossing Molotovs makes the point. The U.S. industry was not built on the writings of Adam Smith. Absolutely not. The writings of Adam Smith were written during the times of mercantilism. That's right. Free trade was a means of the British monarchy to undermine the U.S. economy. Okay. British industry sold the products at prices that drove the U.S. industry out of business. There is no... See, that's the problem. There are not... Even in individuals, as I mentioned, they can either be demented and not understand economics. The idea that everyone acts in their own self-interest and it all works out perfectly is incorrect. The idea that free markets solve everything isn't true. If they may produce a result, it may not be the result that you think is the right result. Every economic actor is not a perfect economic actor. Because if they were, everyone would be much richer. People waste resources. That's a fact. Why? Who knows? I know people, they drink a half a glass of something, they just throw the rest in the sink. That's a waste. They do it all the time. Restaurants, they throw food out all the time. Why? They don't think about it. There's a lot of things that people do that don't make economic sense. Some of it is intentional and some of it's unintentional. But most economic theories take into account that people act in their own economic self-interest and then they act accordingly. Some purposely act against their economic self-interest. Some don't know their economic self-interest. And the same goes for countries. All right. Yeah, Gypsy's been waiting for miners to pull a crypto. Not going to happen. Not like, I mean, never mind. I don't want to get into cryptos and mining. All right. CoinZZ says hello. Okay. Tariffs are bad. Okay. Seth Shepard is mowing his yard. What do you have, one of those electric mowers? I don't know how you can hear anything. What else do we have? Pablo Pina, Smaulgld, let us know if mug tariffs are cutting into your profit. No, they're not. Prices have not been raised on the mugs. In fact, the one thing that did hurt me was they raised the postage, and I have an offer where I pay for priority postage on the mugs, 2-day shipping insured, and that's gone up. But the price of the mug isn't. Comic Commando, imports of spying electronics is climbing, so in Bernie's world, that's a good thing. That's right, that's a good thing. All right. See, where's Barry points out, in their culture, ideas aren't property. And actually, in the anarcho-capitalist point of view, they're not property either. They don't even believe in defamation and reputation because they say, there's nothing, your reputation doesn't belong to you, goes the theory. That's none of your concern. You don't own anything. And it's the same with intellectual property. They don't believe in it. And I don't know what China's view is. I don't know whether they just think they're stealing, they're getting away with it, or they just have the view that ideas are ideas and they're out there once they're out there. The Grateful Dead took that point of view. Once we make the music, it's out there. It's not ours. It's out there. Those are just concepts that people either want to protect as property or not protect. The concept of intellectual property is not universally held by a lot of people. Yeah, where's Barry says we got rare earths. There was a company, Molly PM. There was a bunch of companies out in California that tried to do rare earths. Didn't do very well. They're not very rare, but they're called rare earths. All right. How about Monday Night Mug, says Philip Quinn. Well, we do. We have Muggin' for Life on Monday. If you can't wait, I can play the song now. Muggin' for Life. Yeah, Comic Commando, I tune off Peter Schiff when he goes on and on about U.S. debt but ignores China. I've turned him off for a few years on that point. Peter Schiff does a great job of explaining what I call pure free market economics. But the world isn't based on pure free market economics. And he also seems to be very skewed against the United States. He's always talking about dollar collapse. But and the rationale is the United States runs up a lot of debt. But the world's running up a lot of debt. U.S. is actually in a better position because the rest of the world runs up debt and they run it up in dollar-denominated debt. So they need the dollars more than... Never mind. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining me tonight. And don't forget to get your Smaulgld mugs before the price will inevitably rise. But remember, the value of your mugs are also going to rise because they are indeed rare and mugs can never go to zero. So unless I have any further comments or questions, I'm going to give you the 10-second Bernie countdown. And then I'm going to say goodnight. All right, Bernie.
All right, so I'm going to give you the countdown, but I heard I'm falling in the polls, and that's not true. But tomorrow night, if I
just count the thing down.
All right, so 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, the 1%, 0. Have a good night.
Let's do a little mugging for life before we go. Mugging for life. That's what I want to hear. Yeah, mugging for life. Let's see if we can find it. Mugging for life. Smaulgld.
Yeah, mug life, baby. Mug life, baby. Yeah, we rockin' the booth. We're mugging for life. We're mugging for truth. Smaulgld here, and he's spitting the facts about the pumper community and the way that they act. We're mugging for life. We ain't playing their games. We all know the lies and we all know their names. Come on, mugging for life. Mugging for life. Smaulgld.
Good night.